The US and a number of its Western allies blame China for an alleged cyber spying campaign Washington says is a threat to national security. Beijing says the accusation is groundless. So what's the fallout from this row? This is Inside Story. Welcome to the programme. I'm Sohail Rahman. This was a unified condemnation of China on cyber attacks. The United States, the European Union, NATO and other world powers all said Beijing was responsible for an attack on Microsoft servers earlier this year, but stopped short of announcing punishment measures for alleged cyber activities. Around 250,000 computers are said to have been compromised in March, affecting at least 30,000 organisations worldwide. Nations including Canada, New Zealand, Australia and Japan said Chinese state-linked hacking groups were behind the exploitation. And they accused Beijing of a broad range of malicious cyber activities, including ransomware and cyber espionage. The Chinese Ministry of State Security was singled out. The White House has not ruled out consequences for Beijing, but President Joe Biden said China's behaviour is different from that of Russia, which has faced US sanctions on a number of issues.
That the Chinese government, not unlike the Russian government, is not doing this themselves, but are protecting those who are doing it, and maybe even accommodating them being able to do it. That may be the difference.
The number of countries involved amounts to the largest condemnation of China's cyber activities. It's also the first time that NATO has denounced alleged Chinese cyber attacks. The 30-nation alliance wants all states, including China, to uphold international obligations and act responsibly in cyberspace. While the EU condemned what it described as malicious cyber activities conducted from China and said it resulted in security risks and major economic loss for government institutions and private companies. And the United Kingdom's Foreign Secretary said the Chinese government must end what he called systematic cyber sabotage and can expect to be held to account if it does not. China has rejected the accusations, calling them politically motivated. Here's what the Foreign Ministry spokesman had to say.
The US ganged up with its allies and launched an unwarranted accusation against China on cybersecurity. This is made out of thin air and confused the right and wrong. It is purely smear and suppression out of political motives. China will never accept this. China will always stand firmly against and combat any form of cyber attacks. Still, less we will encourage, support or condone any cyber attack.
American security agencies have published more than 50 tactics they say were used by Chinese hackers to target networks. And the US has indicted 4 Chinese nationals linked to the Ministry of State Security with a large-scale campaign to hack computers between 2011 and 2018. We'll get to our guest shortly, but first, Katrina Yu reports now from Beijing.
This collective condemnation of Chinese cyber attacks by at least 30 countries, including the US, has been deeply embarrassing for Beijing. China has responded by denying that it supported or encouraged any cyber attacks, and it's called these accusations groundless and politically motivated. Now, Beijing is trying to undermine the credibility of the US allegations by saying it has not provided enough evidence, that there are simply too many cyber actors around the world, and it's very difficult to pinpoint their exact location, let alone tie these to a single government. Beijing is also trying to turn the tables on Washington, saying that most cyber attacks around the world occur from inside the United States. It accuses Washington of indiscriminately eavesdropping on the world, not only on competitors, but its own friends and allies. It also says that the CIA has for 11 years been launching cyber attacks against Chinese institutions, including technology, aviation, and energy companies. Now, while broadly denying these claims by the US and the other countries launching these allegations, China has failed to in detail acknowledge any of these allegations of the attacks on Microsoft email exchange servers, which have affected at least 30,000 companies, as well as the indictment of 4 Chinese nationals by the US Department of Justice. Katrina Yu in Beijing for Inside Story.
Well, let's bring in our guests now for this edition of Inside Story. Joining me now via Skype from Washington, D.C. is Bruen, President of the Global Situation Room and a former Global Director Engagement at the White House under President Obama. From Leiden in the Netherlands, James Shire is an Assistant Professor at the Institute of Security and Global Affairs at Leiden University. And in Beijing, Aina Tangen, China political analyst, who also advises the Chinese provincial government. All welcome to all of my guests. Mr. Bruen, can I just start with you first? No smoke without fire, and this fire seems to be getting fanned politically from all sides.
It is, and yet at the moment, I have to say that the Biden administration has taken a rather restrained approach to China and Chinese hacks and attacks, quite frankly, on our infrastructure. It's a different approach than they've taken with Russia, and I think raises a number of questions about the motivations. On the one hand, clearly they're trying to assemble a coalition of countries that are going to hold the line on China, but I don't think it actually has the desired effect. In some ways, it allows Beijing to claim that they are being unfairly persecuted without actually that penalty, that deterrent that is so critically important if we are going to dissuade them from engaging in future attacks.
Okay, Aina Tangen, over in Beijing, let's get your reaction to what Mr. Bruen's just said, but also the feeling at the moment from Beijing, because obviously they're very angry at the moment.
Yes, I mean, just remember that what is this all based on? This is based on a UK investigation by other things that says it's highly likely, quote unquote, that an affiliated entity to the Chinese government instituted these hacks. That's not exactly the kind of proof that a country or coalition of countries who are saying that the rule of law is something they believe in. This is the whole basis of it. So you have these people coming together based on this rather dubious claim. And, how do you disprove that from Beijing's point of view? Also, Beijing thinks it's kind of rich. They're being falsely accused in their mind. And at the same time, you have the Snowden revelations showing that the U.S. was doing far more than anything that the Chinese are, quote, accused of doing. So there's an air of hypocrisy, not only coming from Washington, but also those who are joining in.
And that's an element we'll discuss as well as we unpick this programme. Let me go over to the Netherlands now, where James Shires is standing by. I mean, would the EU, the UK, Australia join in this chorus if there wasn't enough, you might say, credible evidence and a shared approach to the condemnation? While, as you say, Mr. Tangen's just said it's a theory without producing any evidence. I mean, where do you see this at the moment?
Yeah, I think the other speakers are right to emphasise that the UK did not say it was certain. They said this was highly likely. That's standard speak around attributions of cyber incidents, because you can never be certain. On the other hand, I definitely would not describe it as a dubious claim. The fact that all these countries have come out, the fact that the UK and the US, their Five Eyes allies, as well as the EU and NATO, have all come out and said this, suggests that there is rich empirical evidence behind it. We've seen some of that in the public domain from private security companies, but not all of it is out there. And it's very difficult to prove that to an extent in international public sphere.
And I'll be coming back to how we actually unpick that and find the evidence for it in a moment. Mr. Tangen, can I come back to you in Beijing? China's response, as you say, has been robust. They're quite angry about these accusations that have been made for facilitating the potential hack. But they are leaving the question that the Chinese government may have accommodated groups who tacitly are working from Chinese soil, who may be hacking, in a similar vein to the way that the US is treating Russia as well, and saying that various hacks are coming from Russia. What makes this narrative different as far as Beijing is concerned?
Well, Beijing has not acknowledged that there's any groups. They're just pointing out that if there are private interests, just like there are private Chinese citizens who are, for their own enrichment, stealing intellectual property. I don't think if an American steals something from Germany or from Russia, it is attributed to the nation. But for some reason, the Chinese feel that every time anybody Chinese shows up, they're automatically a spy. You'll note that they've just refused 500 students who are postgraduate students in STEM areas because they're all spies. You've heard this repeatedly by Republicans and Democrats on both sides. So this idea that somehow China is guilty before you provide any proof, I beg to differ with my colleague from Australia. I'm a lawyer. I was a prosecutor. I would have been laughed out of court if I went in there and said, Judge, it's highly probable that there may have been an affiliation with a government. I therefore think we should, condemn these people. I mean, if you stand by this kind of rule of law, produce the evidence. Don't stand there and throw nameless accusations on a kind of drumbeat. Remember, this is part and parcel of almost daily criticisms of China for this, that, or the anything. How is it possible that China is the center of all evil in the world? Or if not China, Russia. And they happen to be, what? Geopolitical competitors.
And Mr. Tang, just very briefly then, can I ask what policies or law are in place in China to stop hacking from a local position? Do they have laws in place that stop these sorts of groups?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. No, it is against the law to do that. This is not some sort of lawless society or something like that. Far from it. They have very good laws. The question is enforcement and making sure that they, if they know who these people are, they go after them. Remember, it's one of the few nations that actually does something about corruption as opposed to those who cast stones.
OK, Mr. Bruen, back in Washington, D.C., you'd think that with the combined, you might say, brain power of Silicon Valley, big tech, the NSA, the US would have found a way with its allies to stop hacking or cyber espionage in some shape or form over the years?
Well, certainly, and efforts have been made, but this is one of those challenges that continues to evolve and to morph into different ways. So you solve one problem and then another one emerges. And I would take issue with my friend in Beijing, while he may suggest that, presenting evidence in a court of law, I don't know whether that's a Chinese court or an American one, but, the broader point there is that nothing happens in China without the express permission of the Chinese government. So this notion of plausible deniability, there were these very sophisticated hackers that were operating from Chinese territory unbeknownst to or without the consent of the Chinese government, simply does not pass muster. I'm sorry.
OK, Mr. Shires, let's bring you in here from Leiden to try and clarify. How do you start to investigate hacking? Where do you start technically in the process?
Sure. So that's a really important point in that many of these investigations start in the private sector. In the case of the Microsoft Exchange server vulnerabilities, these were detected by security researchers who were not state affiliated, and then they were detected by private cybersecurity companies working for organizations who were their clients. They detected these kinds of intrusions, and then they escalated that. They let others in the community know, and eventually they also let the states know as well. This went back to Microsoft in this case, and then Microsoft tried to issue a patch. So it all starts from some point of detection, whether that's a security researcher finding a hole in the system or by someone noticing unusual activity on corporate networks thinking, this is wrong, this is unusual, we need to investigate what's behind this. Now, it's very difficult to technically trace that back all the way to the source, to the person sitting behind the keyboard, but it has been done. And this is worth remembering that in previous cases, the US has indicted specific individuals associated with Chinese state, with the Chinese military, for intrusions of this kind. They have provided evidence. There's a wide extent of evidence out there in the public domain from these private security companies, from the US government as well. So even though for the specific exchange hacks, it's highly likely there's not that extent of evidence, it has been done in other times, and we probably expect similar indictments to come out in the future.
And just very briefly,
point I'd like to make.
Sorry, please finish. Please finish.
The last point I'd like to make is in terms of what happened after the hack was discovered, because this is all about the recklessness of the hack and its impact. Initially, it just looked like espionage, that maybe on a large scale, the malicious actor was trying to collect data, trying to read emails from these Microsoft Exchange servers. Once they knew that they'd been caught, once they knew they'd been found out, they tried to multiply this as much as they could, try to compromise as many organizations, and in that way, they left the door open, they left the window open to lots of other actors, cyber criminals, ransomware actors, you name it. So that was the reckless part of the incident, not the early one, which could be considered espionage. All states do it, but the reckless part later on when they try to spread it all over the world.
OK, so we can go back and forth on the blame game, but let's move this forward then. Mr. Tangen, can I come to you in Beijing? The recent G7 meeting that happened in the United Kingdom declared as one of its statements that China posed a huge global threat. China would argue that it's big enough to be part of the global order and it doesn't need to be part of the G7. But would it like to be part of the G7 to be able to explain itself, to be able to be taken to task if needs be? Because at the moment, it seems to be on the outside. And as you say, there's this ongoing scenario where China seems to be browbeaten at every opportunity in turn.
Well, let's put it this way. I think China wants to be part of the UN, which it is. I think it is not too fond of these kind of cliques that have grown up. Remember, the G7 used to describe itself as the most powerful and economically advanced countries on Earth. This time around, if you look through all the verbiage, you'll notice that they dropped economically advanced because all of them had negative growth during this COVID period. China had positive growth. For the last 40 years, China has succeeded, and the developed countries around the world have moved sideways. This is an existential threat to them, and they don't want to admit that things have changed. So that's why there's this ever louder drumbeat that somehow China has cheated simply because it has succeeded. It's a sad state of affairs, but it won't end until countries realize that there are many paths to prosperity, not just one. OK,
then let me take you over to Mr. Bruen in Washington, D.C., because the recent debate and the recent argument over the last 18 months has been about Huawei, the Chinese technology firm that wanted to invest its know-how in the UK's 5G project for its telecommunications. That isn't going to happen. Huawei's chief executive was arrested, incarcerated in Canada. That case is ongoing. A real blow for China to advance its technology across not just Western Europe, but also North America.
Well, and if I could contrast yesterday's statement by the United States and its allies with the approach that the Trump administration took to China. Trump really tried to bulldoze, to bully a lot of countries, including the United Kingdom, into turning down Huawei's 5G capabilities. I think the Biden administration is making more progress, and that this is probably more sustainable in trying to work alongside allies, even if they're not willing to go quite as far as we would like them to. And that has got to worry Beijing, because what we saw yesterday was the world standing together and declaring with one voice that this is unacceptable. I think it builds on the statement that came out of the G7. And you're going to see more of this. You're going to see efforts by those countries that are aligned with democratic values saying to China, this behavior, this kind of reckless, risky behavior is not going to be tolerated. The question that looms large, though, is what are we going to do about it? And will the United States, will European and other allies be willing to put some penalties alongside those strong words?
Will penalties be enough for Beijing, Aina Tangen? One wonders whether or how China would retaliate if the EU or US start walking down the road of sanctions.
Well, it's not going to change China. And, this kind of pious tone that somehow the whole world has said this when it is, in fact, just a bunch of colonial countries who used to are responsible for many of the atrocities that have grown. I mean, China hasn't started any wars. They haven't broken any countries. They're not leaving Afghanistan behind. They didn't do the things that were put forward by Snowden in terms of actually hacking into the cloud and making sure they had access not only to China, but everybody else's information in the world. I mean, this is really an age of post-hypocrisy. When I'm on a show where people are talking about how evil and terrible China is, when in fact, They're just accusing China of things that they have done themselves, yet they don't have any proof against China. It's fine for my colleague in Australia to say that, gee whiz, there was this and that, but he didn't say at any point that it was definitively tied back to China. Yet he's quite happy to have that. I wonder how he would feel if the situation was reversed and Australia was being handled this way.
Well, our guest isn't in Australia, but in Washington, D.C. and in the Netherlands. But I know what you're getting at, Aina, in the sense. But these accusations are coming from, you might say, the Western world. They are coming from Europe. They are coming from North America. And quite surprisingly...
But did you notice that he said it was a united world? How is that possible, that the G7 speaks for the entire world when they won't even give COVID vaccines to them?
Brett Bruen, the united world, go on.
Yeah, no, I think the point being is that you're seeing a much stronger alliance across the Pacific, across the Atlantic, among some of the most significant global powers, and that is unprecedented. And we can, quibble about what is, a global voice, what is, regional or a collection of countries. I also would say to my friend in Beijing that, there have been not just, these accusations, but a whole series of accusations and with a whole lot of proof. And let's not forget that there are millions of Uyghurs in Xinjiang province who might beg to differ with the rosy picture that he paints of China and its record on human rights and respect for the rule of law. So I think what is important here in these statements, if I could bring the conversation back to the core question, is what rules as a global community are countries going to respect, and especially when it touches on cyberspace. And this is somewhat the Wild West, and we're starting to see countries and coalitions of countries come together to try to set some standards. You saw this, for instance, in the meeting that Biden had with President Putin, and I think there will be more to come.
OK, Bruen, let me just bring in then James Shires, because if this is the Wild West in terms of cybersecurity, cyber development, what needs to be done? Who needs to be policing it? And can it be policed through an internet that is so wide and varied?
So the starting point is to say, I think the Wild West analogy is maybe a bit overcooked. I really don't like describing actions that occur in cyberspace as the Wild West because they are connected to other political, economic, and other state actions. There are international legal rules that do apply to cyberspace. There are international norms that apply to cyberspace as well. These have been discussed extensively, and they've been agreed at several UN fora. There's been groups of governmental experts at a small scale. There's been larger working groups with all relevant states who have agreed that norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace should be adopted more widely. These include things like not engaging in reckless cyber attacks. So saying that it's a Wild West really undervalues the extent to which we have these norms out there. The question then is, how do you try and improve compliance with these norms and, as you say, have sanctions or punishments for when they're not occurred? Now you can have non-cyber responses such as sanctions, such as diplomatic statements, as we've seen. We can also have responses in cyberspace. And this is where it gets a little bit more tricky when states choose to respond to cyber operations with their own cyber operations. In response to our friend in Beijing, they say, well, it's always China that's called out. That's definitely not true in the cybersecurity community. They've called out many cyber operations conducted by the US and its allies as much as they've called out China and Russia. So, the intellectual community, the expert community is much more objective here, and they do have a lot of evidence. Finally, I'd like to say on this point of responses to sanctions and things, we've seen from China's recent responses in Europe to reports of violations around human rights, around the Uyghurs, that they respond very strongly to politicians and to expert commentators in Europe. And we could expect that to happen similarly here.
I think that might be the right moment to actually end our conversation. Unfortunately, we have just run out of time. I'm sure it will be a subject that we come back to in the not too distant future. It's always good to get your insight. I'd like to thank Brett Bruen in Washington, D.C., James Shires in Leiden, and Aina Tangen in Beijing. Gentlemen, thanks for joining me on this edition of Inside Story. And thank you for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sohail Rahman, and the Inside Story team, thanks very much for your time and your company.